Hey folks, welcome back to the Edupedia world, and I am Abhinay Gupta. And today again we will be continuing with the standards in auditing. And the standard under consideration for today's lecture would be SA 620, which is using the work of an auditor's expert. Right? So let me again remind you that this is not the first lecture that we are holding on this topic. We have had around 3 more lectures, right? So first go back, refer to those lectures, and then come to this, because this is a continuation. So unless and until you have been through those lectures, maybe there are certain points that would go as a bouncer over your head, right? So it is recommended go through those video lectures first and then come back to this, right? So what have we covered in those lectures is the scope and objectivity, which is the non-applicability, the responsibility, and the objectivity of the auditor, right? Further, we have also covered certain definition which is very important. One is the auditor's expert. This is indeed one of the most important definition, because this actually goes on to give you an overall idea about the standard. Then we have also covered the expertise and the management expert as definitions, right? And then we moved on to your favorite portion, which is the requirements. Okay, and in the requirement we have already covered the determining the need of an auditor's expert, right? Whether or not you need an auditor's expert would be determined. Next is the evaluation of the nature, time, and extent of the audit procedures, and then the competence, capabilities, and objectivity of the auditor's expert has to be evaluated by you, right? These requirements have already been covered in the previous lectures in detail, right? We have been to an extent to discuss about them, right? So that now whatever queries, whatever questions you have in the examination, right, that would be somewhere or the other related to what we have discussed in the previous lectures. The examples that we have taken, the cases that we have discussed, right? There's 99% probability that if you get a question, you would get a question from the discussion that we have had, right? Because what basically happens is when you go on to discuss any or to study about any standard, you go with studying the 2 pages of the standard that is given in most of the books that you refer, right? Why I'm so confident about it is because even I have been students and I have had friends, right? And we have all been studying the same way. We had notes from a particular teacher, we had books to refer, and all of them, what they had done basically is they had summarized the entire standard. A 10-20 page standard was summarized into 2 pages, where they had given you just the bullet points. This. And as a student, what we fail to understand is that those are just the bullet points. If you get a direct question in the examination, those bullet points are going to help you if you quote them over there. But if you need an understanding to solve any of the case studies, then that becomes a challenge for you in the examination, and you go on writing whatever you know from that limited content, right? That is why this discussion, although it will take some time, but we will do it in detail to help you out to understand and analyze it from different angles. So today we'll start with obtaining an understanding of the field of expertise of the auditor's expert. Now, why do you think is it important for you as an auditor to obtain an understanding of the field of expert? That is because that understanding about the field of expertise, right, will give you an insight which will help you to determine the nature, timing, and scope and objectivity of the expert's work, right? That will have, or the effect that it will have on your procedures, right? And then it will also help you to evaluate the adequacy of the work of the auditor, of the expert, right? And when you are done with that, you are able to proceed with your assignment in a more effective manner. Now, when you go ahead to understand the field of expertise of the expert, right, what are the basic aspects that you would try and understand? So remember one thing, right? Don't consider that over here we are discussing about the field of expertise that is required by us. No, we are discussing about what is the field of expertise of that expert, and is that relevant for us in the audit, right? So it is the other direction that we are seeing. It's not that, okay, we require this and we have to see whether the auditor is able to perform this. No, we are saying that yes, the auditor is able to perform A, and what we are requiring, is it A or is it B? So we are looking at it from the point of view of the expert, right? So expert has some XYZ qualifications, he has some XYZ expertise, and now we need to evaluate whether that XYZ expertise is what we actually need, right? So first of all, you will have to analyze whether the expert's field or the area of the speciality of that expert, right, whether is it relevant for your audit, right? You'll also see whether there, on that expertise, on the field of expertise, is there any professional or the standard or legal regulatory bodies or requirement that is applicable on it? Is it guided by any regulatory requirements, any professional body? If yes, then you put on then you have more reliance on it, right? Because you know it is not something that is derived by that expert. It is something that has been given as a standard to him, right? Once you know that, okay, his field of expertise is of use to you, plus it is guided by some professional and the legal requirements, right? Then you will also have to see what are the assumptions that the expert is taking, what is the method that he is applying to evaluate and give you the result of what you require as an auditor. You will have to judge what models is he applying, what are the procedures that he is following, is that procedure generally accepted, is it according to that regulatory or legal requirement, it is at par with the professional standard, right? If it is going that way, then you would be placing more reliance on it. But if it is something out of the box, right, or if you think that the expert is trying it for the first time, then you would be at a little risk. Why? Because that is not the standard procedure that is to be followed. And if there is something coming up new, you will not always consider that, okay, he's an expert and he will give me the right answer all the time. No. That is somewhere you know it's a risk, because he's applying it for the first time. And then you need to evaluate what are the assumptions you have taken, what is the procedure have you followed, what are you trying to obtain out of it, and what have you actually obtained, and will that be useful for me, right? And finally, this is about the procedures he has followed, but you'll also check on what data is he following this, or is he applying these procedures. Is that data correct? Right? Always whenever we have discussed about certain things, we have always paid good lot of attention to what data is being provided. Is the data correct in the first instance? Because if you have an improper input, then whatever be the procedure that you apply, you will seldom get an appropriate output. Right? Now further, you also need to analyze, right, that there is a need of an agreement between the auditor and the expert. And in that case, whosoever is the expert, whether he is from your firm itself, from the auditor's firm itself, the internal expert, or an external expert that is being appointed by the auditor for the specific task, right? Now, why do the auditor and the expert, right, why do they get into an agreement? What is the reason behind them getting into the agreement, right? If we try and analyze that why, and the agreement is supposed to be in writing, so that there is documentary evidences, and which will not allow any one of them, either the auditor or the expert, to deviate from that, right? Basically, why would you need an agreement is that when an expert, he comes to the entity and he has to perform certain tasks, right? The auditor also, when he actually was appointed by the entity, he had signed an agreement, an engagement letter was signed, right? An agreement about the auditor's responsibility, that he'll maintain the confidentiality, etc., right? Because there are sensitive information of the entity that will be exposed to the auditor. And similarly, if the auditor feels like involving an expert in any of those fields, then he would also need to disclose certain information which is sensitive for the entity to the expert, right? So the expert also has to maintain the same level of confidentiality as the auditor, and this will be agreed between the both on the basis of an agreement, right? And now you also understand that if there is a repetitive role that has been followed over the past years also in the audit, right? But in this particular situation, when the auditor involves an expert, he may not be the same expert who was involved in the previous audit, right? So their roles, their responsibilities, their procedures, they may differ. So you cannot say that, okay, it's a repetitive basis and we go on in the similar manner. No, there can be differences, and for that differences, to account for the same, you need to have an agreement, right? And then beyond that, the auditor is governed by different statute, right? The expert may be governed by different statute. There may be different legal and regulatory requirements for the expert and the auditor, right? So when there is a play of a multi-jurisdictional legal and regulatory requirement, then there need to be an agreement between the two to draw the line between them, right? To be agreed on a common platform, right? So that there is a standard procedure that could be followed by the auditor as well as the expert, so that they are in line with each other, right? And also remember that, okay, when you are appointing an expert, right, it is deemed to be understood that that area where you are involving the expert is a complicated area, right? Because if it would have been so simple, the auditor would have done it himself, right? Because the auditor does not possess the requisite knowledge and capability and understanding of the task that needs to be performed, he is involving an expert, right? Since there is complexity that has been involved over here, right, hence the procedures taken forward by the auditor's expert would also be very complex, right? So you need to have an agreement that, okay, even if you are entering into such procedure which is beyond my bandwidth to understand as an auditor, right, we will agree on certain terms that yes, you will give me access to these informations, I will give you access to these informations, you will let me understand the procedures you are following. Why? Because ultimately it is the responsibility of the auditor and not the expert, right? That is the first line we dealt with when we were starting with the 600 series, that ultimately the responsibility of the overall opinion will always rest upon the auditor. So he will have to evaluate whether the work of the audit of the external expert or the internal auditor or the another auditor is relevant, right? He has to judge before using their work in forming an opinion. So since it is very complex, they have to agree on certain terminologies that will help the auditor, right, to understand the work of the expert. Because if the expert does not give him the requisite access or the knowledge about it, the auditor will never be able, or not very easily be able, to understand the procedures followed by the expert. And that will actually be a little difficult situation for the auditor to form an opinion and to depend upon the findings of the expert. And the agreement would also be needed if the auditor has not previously used the work of that expert, right? Because he's not aware of how he's going to perform, what are the problems that he'll be facing and everything. So he wants to keep everything crisp and clear via an agreement which would be in written form, right? And the greater the involvement of the expert, greater will be his significance in the context of the audit, right? And greater would be the degree of reliance, and hence the agreement becomes again very important, right? So you understand, this is one thing that we haven't discussed so far, that okay, when you are also appointing an expert, right, for any particular task, you get into an agreement with him, right, which is basically in the form of an engagement letter, right? And that is very important, and these are the factors that we have discussed why it becomes important for you, right? Clear with that, right? So basically this agreement would serve as an evidence, right, for the later reference. But what if they do not enter into an agreement? Is it a compulsion that they should enter into an agreement? No, right? But that would actually solve the purpose of convenience, that at the end, if you want any responsibility fixation, if you want any documentation, if you want any references, then for that you need an agreement. But if, for instance, there is no agreement, does that mean that you will not be able to fix responsibilities, or you will not be able to track down if in case of any fault, or you will not be able to reconciliate the matter? No, you can do that, right? But how would you do that in the absence of an agreement? You will check the work, who did what, you will have to get into the details. Okay, you did not agree as to what was to be done, but still you have performed tasks, right? What was your planning? Refer to the planning document of the auditor and also the expert, right? The working papers that they have prepared related to the work that they have performed, and the entire audit program that had been designed. So this is what would actually give you the evidence of who performed what and whose task was related to which aspect. This is only referred in case of an absence of the agreement, because if there is an agreement and it has been signed, that means it is specifically decided among both the parties to get under with that scope and objectivity, right? Now other things also, right, if the expert, right, if he is an internal member of the audit firm, then you must have some protocols, you must have some policies, some procedures that is abiding the audit firm, right? So that will also be applicable on the internal expert, right? So that is where you know that okay, this is his area, this is his bandwidth, this is his extent, his scope, his nature, right? That is what would be evaluated. But if he is an external person, then you will have to see what is going on in the industry, what are the legal regulatory frameworks which are applicable on him, Right. Now, for example, if you are using the work of an expert, right, you will also have to document that yes, this is the reason, this is the fact or event that I have encountered, and since I do not have the requisite knowledge and expertise to judge these matters, I have employed an expert, right, or I have involved an expert, whatever is it. So when you have a written agreement over there, you write it, okay, then this is the reason why I'm involving you, this is your responsibility, this is my responsibility, this is the work that is expected out of you, and everything, right? But if there is nothing like that, then the auditor has to prepare a documentation to prove that, okay, this is what was the reason behind or the rationale behind my involvement of this expert, right? But even that would not be needed if he is an internal expert and you have determined or detailed protocols regarding the use of an expert in certain circumstances, and if the circumstance fall under that protocol, then you can automatically appoint an expert without those documentation, right, because your protocol will already have defined the facts and the procedures, right? And also remember that whenever you are using the work of this expert, right, when you are determining the nature, the scope, the objectivity, you will always have to give due consideration to the professional standards, the technical performance standards of that expert, right, or whatever the profession or the industry of that expert requires. The nature, timing and extent would always be at par with such requirements. And as far as the working papers are concerned, the auditor definitely he has to attach all his working papers with his reports, right? That is like what we do is we have an e-audit file that we maintain, that is an electronic audit file, and over there we attach all the documentations that we have done. We have to fill up all the criteria that is given over there and the entire procedures that we have followed, right? So e-audit is basically converting the entire audit into the electronic form to be stored for future references, right, or for review or whatever purpose, right? So even when we complete our audit, we have to spend 3-4 days performing or forming the e-audit, right? Basically what we are required is to perform the e-audit along with the audit that we are doing. As we finalize our working paper, attach it over there, write the descriptions, give all the conclusions over there, everything, right? It is in detail over there. So even this e-audit file and the retention of the documents and everything, and the use of the documentation, the working paper. So the auditor is responsible for his own working paper, right? And he will have to attach it wherever required. But the expert, right, he need not necessarily share all the working papers with the auditor. Obviously, whatever is required by the auditor, right, he will gain the access because he wants to know what the procedures he has performed, right? But the working paper will not form a part of the final document that is prepared by the auditor, right? Because that is the own working paper of the external expert. If he wants to hand over, he will hand over. If he does not want to hand over, he will not hand it over to the auditor, right? And they both have respective responsibilities with each other's work, right? Like who will form the detailed testing of the source data? Now, if you have involved an expert, the expert will be performing certain tasks, right? And for that, he needs certain data. Now, will he himself be testing the source data, or will you test the source data for him and give it to him? Right? Even that is a part of the agreement, right? So for the source data, if you are testing it, the work paper will be retained by you. If he's testing it, the work paper will be retained by the expert, right? Refer to the auditor's consent that he has to include the findings and conclusions of the expert in his report, whether it's modified, unmodified. Basically in unmodified, you do not include anything like that, but in unmodified, you may have to give an emphasis on matter paragraph. And at the end, you have two other important aspects over here, which is the communication and the confidentiality. When we talk about communication, yes, the auditor and the auditor's expert, right, both of them will have to have a proper communication throughout the procedure. Because when the auditor has to use the work of the expert in determining the nature, time and extent of his procedures, and also the effect of the findings of the expert on his opinion, on his report, right? So he will have to have a proper communication throughout, in written, with the work papers, the oral communication and everything, right? Because his progress of work will also depend on the progress of the work of the expert. So for this purpose, maybe he can appoint a staff or a partner from his team to have a constant communication with the expert, right? Because the communication between the two is very important. So at any point of time, if the expert is finding any difficulty with his task, he would communicate with the auditor for support, right? And the auditor, when he is evaluating something, he may require certain data from the expert as well. And since the confidentiality is one of the key ethical requirements that hence the management would also want that the auditor signs an agreement of confidentiality with the expert. That means the confidentiality is maintained even at the expert's end. It is as simple as that. So that was all about obtaining an understanding of the field of expertise of the auditor's expert. I know it's a little lengthy topic, it's a long discussions that we are getting into, right? But you have to be with the flow, right? That will help you to analyze it. I can't help it out, this is the content given by the institute. So we will have to abide by all of these and we cannot miss out, right? Because it becomes a risky point. Now, okay, this is done over here. We'll move on to the next, which is agreement with the auditor's expert. No, agreement with the auditor's expert is decided, right? That the discussion that we just had with the agreement, that is the part of the agreement with the auditor's expert. Now we are actually moving on to evaluating the adequacy of the auditor's expert work. Now even this point would require a little detailed understanding, right? So already we have discussed two basic requirements in detail so far. So we would try to skip this one for the lecture, and it's a very small part which is remaining, right? We'll take it up in the next lecture, and if we finish it on time, we will move on to the next standard in the next lecture itself, right? Or we may even cut short that lecture for you to just wind it up in that lecture and move on to the next in a fresh new lecture. So that will depend, right, on the situation that we face in the next lecture. So until then, this is Abhinay Gupta signing off. I'll see you guys in the next lecture with the last portion of requirement pending, right? Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for being with Edupedia World. Take the off, prepare it well, and see you in the next lecture.